Welcome everybody. Come on in, grab a seat, grab a chair, pull up a chair. So it's my pleasure today to welcome Joseph Smith, assistant professor in philosophy and Africana Studies. Is that right? Did I get that right? And he's going to be speaking on Cornel West and the Black prophetic tradition. So please welcome Joe.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank Matt Brown for extending this invitation to me to come to the prestigious Dewey Center to give a talk. I also would like to thank his administrative staff who supports him, as well as the graduate students. It's a great honor, actually, for me to be here, especially given Cornel West's relationship to the pragmatic tradition. So my talk today is called On the Black Hand Side, Cornel West and the Black Prophetic Critique of Pragmatism. So, because I have to turn this way because it's not on my screen. So the kind of purpose of this is to engage classical American pragmatism as a model for democratic possibility. No worries. It re-examines West's critique through the lens of the prophetic, revealing new pathways for radical democratic thought. Third, it confronts the tensions between pragmatism and Black prophetic thought, and it highlights the radical demands of the prophetic tradition. So you can kind of check that out while I read. So throughout his career, Cornel West has described himself as a Black philosopher, a thinker whose work is rooted in the Black prophetic tradition, while simultaneously relying on schools of thought within the Western philosophical canon, especially American pragmatism. The self-description is not a casual claim. It is central to how West understands the vocation of philosophy itself. His intellectual formation took shape within Western formal institutions, as well as emerging out of the Black church, the blues, and the prophetic voices of struggle that have long challenged America's democratic pretensions. These two inheritances form the tension that animate his life's work. So in books such as The American Invasion of Philosophy, Prophesy Deliverance, Keeping Faith, and Black Prophetic Fire, West consistently turns his gaze inward, practicing a self-reflective mode of philosophical inquiry. He writes not as a detached scholar, but as a participant in an unfinished democratic experiment, examining how his own identity as a Black philosopher positions him between two traditions that are both intellectual resources and moral obligations. From this perspective, philosophy becomes not merely the love of wisdom, but the courage to think publicly about how wisdom might serve freedom, justice, and the flourishing of oppressed peoples, especially Black people. So what distinguishes West's project is his insistence that philosophy must confront the question: what does it mean to be human in the face of unnecessary forms of social misery? For him, this is not an abstract metaphysical inquiry, but an existential and political one. To be human, in West's sense, is to wrestle with catastrophe without yielding to despair, to respond to the absurdity of suffering with love, solidarity, and courage. His work challenges audiences to recognize how structures of white supremacy, economic greed, and imperial violence disfigure our democratic hopes, and yet how human beings still bear the capacity to enact compassion and truth-telling amid devastation. So West's writings also press a second, equally urgent question. So what resources are needed to sustain courageous action for democratic possibility, especially when catastrophe seems inevitable? So here, West turns to the prophetic dimension of Black culture, the sermons, the spirituals, the blues, and the everyday acts of resistance that carry a people through suffering without surrendering their humanity. This is what he calls prophetic criticism, a practice that resists cynicism without offering false consolation, exposing the idols of power while still affirming the possibility of moral and democratic renewal. It is within this context that I want to engage West's notions of prophetic criticism, not as a doctrine, but as a discipline of hope, a way of speaking truth to power while sustaining the soul amid the collapse and implosion of what he often calls American empire. So in the preface to Keeping Faith, Cornel West confronts the crisis of coming out a predominantly white academic world while I'm trying to stay grounded in the African American tradition. This struggle leaves him suspended between inheritance and rootlessness, tradition and homelessness as a black philosopher. As such, he writes of his attempt to situate himself between what he calls the best of Euro American modernity and the prophetic elements of New World African modernity. This is not simply a biographical reflection, it is a philosophical declaration. So West locates his entire intellectual project within the creative and often painful tension between these two modernities, both of which he claims as his inheritance and responsibility. It is these two traditions that prophetic criticism rests on. So first, West describes prophetic criticism as an intellectual inquiry that is constitutive of existential democracy, of which the resources stands on what he calls the best of Euro-American modernity. When West refers to the best of Euro-American modernity, he is pointing to the critical energies of modern thought and modes of being in the world, such as the courage to question, the cultivation of individuality, and the democratic impulse that resists dogma, hierarchy, and power. Further, he believes that the best of Euro-American modernity is a self-critical and self-corrective enterprise of human self-making that preserves and expands human empathy and compassion. As West states, it is, quote, the existential imperative to institutionalize critiques of illegitimate authority and arbitrary uses of power, a bestowal of dignity, grandeur, and tragedy on the ordinary lives of everyday people, an experimental form of life that highlights curiosity, wonder, contingency, adventure, danger, and most importantly, improvisation, end quote. In other words, West finds a restless spirit of critique while insisting that human beings possess the capacity to shape their own destinies through reason, reflection, and collective action. Although West draws on a range of European thinkers, it is John Dewey's pragmatism that emerges as a leading example of the political aspects of existential democracy. Before moving on, it is important to note that his phrase the best of signals discernment. West refuses the self-congratulatory myth that modernity is the single story of progress, of enlightenment. He knows that the same West that produced reason also produced racism, that the Enlightenment's universal man was too often white, male, and European. Thus, West engages the best of Euro-American modernity from a critical lens, yet attempts to create community, solidarity, and a political commitment to racial and social justice for those who continue in this tradition. Second, New World African modernity names a different kind of modern experience, one born not in the lecture halls of Europe, but in the back rooms, plantation, and streets of the Americas. It is the creativity and courage of African descendant peoples who fashion meaning, style, and prophetic vision out of predicaments disproportionately shaped by white supremacy. West often turns to the spirituals, the blues, the black church, the black intellectual tradition, and the democratic struggles of black folk as enduring sites that not only institutionalize critiques of white supremacy, but also nurture the life strategies of joy, love, meaning, solidarity, and collective well-being that seek to sustain the everyday lives of black folk in a world where despair, hopelessness, and a hard heart remain ever viable alternatives. For West, this tradition is neither pre-modern nor anti-modern. It is a counter-modernity, a moral and aesthetic response to the hypocrisies of Western civilization that expands the very meaning of what it is to be modern by radically interrogating and creatively appropriating Euro-American modernity. Although West relies on a range of black artists, activists, and intellectuals, he asserts that the early work of W. Du Bois as a leading example of the political aspects of existential democracy. No fact, no words. In fact, West draws on Du Bois's notion of double consciousness to explore the tension between New World African modernity and Euro-American modernity. I'll keep on. It is this interplay that West acknowledges prophetic criticism's vulnerability to a kind of Du Boisian double consciousness. For West, double consciousness names the condition of being simultaneously within and against modernity, which is a consequence of Black Americans' exclusion from the human family by white supremacists, through which Black people were compelled to remake and recreate themselves in alien circumstances and with alien languages and products. To embody, the New World African modernity. Right? Okay. Yep, that's fine. Missed one. Uh, to embody the New World African modernity is to live in two temporalities at once, to carry the scars of slavery and dreams of democracy, to speak the language of modern philosophy, while also drawing from the cries and rhythms and poetics of the Black prophetic tradition. So double consciousness then is not merely a psychological split, it is an epistemological posture, a way of seeing the world through two lenses. So this doubleness also provides a soil out of which West's prophetic criticism grows. Prophetic criticism, as West envisions it, is the ethical and existential practice that enables him to hold these two inherences together, collapsing one into the other. To keep faith, then, as the book title insists, is to maintain fidelity to this doubleness. Faith here is not dogmatic or belief in fixed absolutes. It is an ethical posture, a steadfast commitment to the fragile possibility of human transformation. West's faith is tragic, not triumphant. It recognizes that catastrophe is ever present, that progress is partial, and that democracy is always unfinished. Yet, to keep faith means refusing to give up in the face of despair, dogmatism, and unrelenting power. Refusing to surrender the beauty and dignity of human life, even when the evidence of history tempts us toward despair. It is, in West's words, the blues inflected recognition that, quote, we can never eliminate evil, but we can fight it. We can never eradicate suffering, but we can alleviate it. We can never achieve utopia, but we can imagine and struggle for a better world, end quote. Prophetic criticism, then, is not simply a method for social analysis. It is a way of living within contradiction. So here we must ask, why does West believe it is necessary for Black philosophers and Black intellectuals more broadly to dwell within these two temporalities and to one end? In keeping faith, West responds, quote, the major priority of Black intellectuals should be the creation or reactivation of institutional networks that promote high-quality critical habits primarily for the purpose of Black insurgency, end quote, which prefigure and point toward a post-Western civilization. This task involves cultivating alternative perceptions and practices that unsettle prevailing discourses and structures of power. Equally important, West insists that Black intellectual production and creativity must extend beyond the academy, taking root in local Black institutions that sustain resistance and political struggle, while also engaging progressive circles more broadly. So in this way, the measure of success for Black intellectuals is not the defeat of esoteric or highbrow arguments, but the re-energizing of people in their struggle for greater freedom and a more profound democracy. While West offers prophetic criticism as a profoundly life-affirming mode of being for Black philosophers and Black intellectuals, our discussion moves beyond his framing to press on his unresolved tensions, the deep and often irreconcilable strains within American pragmatism and the Black prophetic tradition. So West identifies and inhabits these contradictions, but he leaves certain dimensions unexamined. So what remains unthought in his synthesis, we argue, are the analytical costs of reconciling two traditions while fundamentally with fundamentally different orientations toward modernity, power, and suffering. Thus, rather than simply affirming West's capacity to live within the contradiction, our task is to probe these contradictions more fully, to ask what gets lost when we seek harmony between the prophetic and the pragmatic. In doing so, we aim to clarify not only the form of double consciousness that West describes, but also the theoretical possibilities that exceed it, frameworks that may offer more expansive tools for Black struggle, resistance, and democratic possibilities. To pursue this inquiry, the remainder of our talk stages a dialogue between W. Du Bois and key figures within American pragmatism, namely George Herbert Mead and John Dewey. So one might ask, why Mead when West names Du Bois and Dewey as the preeminent figures of their respective traditions? Simply put, Mead's conception of the doubled subject provides a critical bridge for understanding how self-consciousness and recognition operate within the social field, a framework that illuminates what Du Bois calls double consciousness while also exposing the limits of pragmatism's faith and demonstrating the social and structural constraints of subjectivity. While what is at stake across these dialogues, as we will show, is the status of reason and recognition within democracy, whether the social world offers reciprocal inclusion or is structured through racialized exclusion. So in light of this, the remainder of the talk will pursue two aims. So first, to examine the tension between Mead's understanding of the double subject and Du Bois' notion of double consciousness. And second, to interrogate the limits of Dewey's conception of critical intelligence as a tool for deepening democracy by placing his idea of dramatic rehearsal in dialogue with Du Bois' account of the irrational. So Mead and Du Bois on double consciousness. In Play, the Game, and the Generalized Other, George Herbert Mead understands the self not as an isolated essence, but as a social process that emerges from individuals' interactions with others. This process produces what he calls the double structure of the self, in which the self sees itself from the standpoint of others. Mead outlines the emergence of this double self in a three-part developmental model of self-consciousness within children, namely what he calls play, the game, and the generalized other. So in play, the child takes on the roles of specific others and begins to internalize how others respond to specific stimuli or experience and begins to take them up as their own. For example, a child uses imaginative play to act as mother, teacher, policeman, etc. Discussing this process, Mead states, quote, they organize in this way the responses which they call out in other persons and call out also in themselves, end quote. At this stage, the roles remain separate and disconnected because in imaginative play, there are no real consequences for failing to follow the rules. So, for example, I can play at being cops and robbers, and I can play that I'm the robber who arrests the cop and takes the cop to jail. So there's no real definite social relationships and rules in imaginative play. So in the game, Mead explains that unlike in play, the various roles and the responses or attitudes of others now hold definite and organized relationships to one another as, quote, the rules are the set of responses which a particular attitude calls out, end quote. Here, the child learns the logic of collective action, understanding the rules, anticipating others' moves, and recognizing interdependence that makes shared activity possible. Here again, we can think about George Herbert Mead's use of team sports. So when you're on a team like a baseball team, and you're the pitcher about to deliver the ball to the batter, you have to already anticipate when the batter swings and potentially hits the ball, what your other teammates are going to do, so that the shared activity is to get the batter out, right? You can't do that without definite rules and roles. So this developmental process culminates in relation to the generalized other. So Mead's concept of the generalized other is more complex than the previous two stages. So for our purposes, we will distill Mead's account into three distinct yet interconnected claims. First, the individual develops a fully realized self only by internalizing not just the attitudes of particular others, but the generalized attitudes of the entire community toward its shared social activities and projects, thereby learning to act in coordination with the social group or society as a whole. Second, the cooperative activities and institutions of organized society are possible only when individuals adopt these generalized attitudes and direct their behavior in relation to the social whole they constitute. Lastly, the self-conscious individual internalizes the organized attitudes of their social group and or broader community toward its ongoing social problems and cooperative projects regarding their conduct in accordance with these shared undertakings. So let's pause here and consider what the cash out of Mead's conceptualization might be. Beginning with Mead's developmental model, his account does have the felt quality of naming almost of naming aspects that almost, if not all, human beings undergo in developing self-consciousness. So almost all of us can recall a time in childhood when we played at being a doctor, a teacher, or an athlete, imaginatively taking on the attitudes of others in response to particular situations and roles. We also can remember participating in group games that required following shared rules in order to be part of the game. Lastly, we can all point to the collective activities or projects, whether in our social groups or broader communities, and to the social problems those groups face. So in this sense, to borrow Cornel West's language, quote, we are born into and built and build on circumstances, traditions, and situations not of our own choosing, end quote, that constrain our subjectivity and sets the group's problems that must be overcome. So the cash out then is that Mead's model gives us a logic of sameness. All selves from comparable social and structural conditions that enable participation in a shared moral community. So I quote Mead here at length so that we can get it. So as Mead himself writes, I have so far emphasized what I have called the structures upon which the self is constructed, the framework of the self, as it were. So of course, we are not only what is common to all here, what are all common to all. Each one of the selves is different from everyone else, but there has to be such a common structure as I have sketched out in order that they may be members of a community at all. Okay? We cannot be ourselves unless we are also members in whom there is a community of attitudes which control the attitudes of all. We cannot have rights unless we have common attitudes. That which we have acquired as self-conscious persons makes us such members of society and gives us selves. Selves can only exist in definite relationships to other selves. The individual possesses a self only in relation to the selves of other members of this social group or his social group. And the structure of his self expresses or reflects the general pattern of behavior of this social group to which he belongs, just as does the structure of the self of every other individual belonging to this social group. But there's another example of play that Mead mentions and leaves unexamined that exposes a critical tension between his framework and, as we will see, Du Bois. Mead briefly refers to children playing cowboys and Indians. In this game, the roles are not merely different, they are structured by logics of different, built on the project of asymmetrical colonial and racial domination that is constitutive of U.S. democracy. The cowboy is imagined as fully human, authorized to conquer, and endowed with the right to commit violence, while the Indian is cast as the non-human other, the object of that violence. Here, the social and structural asymmetries of race and colonialization surface within the very process of imaginative play. Although Mead does not analyze this racialized dimension, his own example portrays an implicit awareness of it. And this is precisely where Du Bois begins, with the lived experience of those for whom self-consciousness is formed under the condition of exclusion and dehumanization. While Mead gives us the logic of sameness, Du Bois gives us the logic of difference. It is in this disjunction between these two, between the universal subject of Mead and the racialized subject of Du Bois, that the central tension and irreconcilable difference between their conceptions of selfhood comes into view. Where Mead's developmental logic universalizes the condition for selfhood, Du Bois begins from the historical and structural production of exclusion, the site where recognition becomes domination. So we now turn to Du Bois's analytic. When Du Bois introduces double consciousness in the souls of Black folk, he describes Black self-consciousness emerging within two registers. On the first, double consciousness serves as an analytic for understanding how white supremacy, as a project of racial domination, conditions but does not determine the formation of Black subjectivity. This project installs a social and ontological order that marks the Black body as the inferior other. Visible, yet dehumanized, rendered legible only through exclusion. In other words, the structures of American life, its laws, institutions, and cultural norms, produce the conditions under which Black people are denied recognition as full human subjects and thus excluded from the moral, political, and cultural community of the nation. As a result, Black self-consciousness develops within a social field that compels the internalization of white supremacy, a forced self-relation mediated by the gaze of a world that defines Black life as a lack. As Du Bois writes, the United States is, quote, a world which yields Black people no true self-consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of the other, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels their two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideas, and one dark body, end quote. Double consciousness then names not merely a psychological state, but the lived effect of a racial order embedded in the cultural, social, economic, and political institutions of American democracy, a system that continually reproduces Black people as inferior subjects. In this sense, the white world does not simply see the Black subject, it organizes itself to make Black subjectivity intelligible only as negation. Here lies the profound break with Mead. For Du Bois, the social world does not provide the common framework that makes selfhood possible. It provides the hierarchy that fractures it. On the second register, Du Bois turns from the structures that fracture Black self-consciousness to the inner strength that holds it together. Even as white supremacy seeks to destroy conditions of Black survival, Du Bois insists that Black selfhood endures through what he calls, quote, its dogged strength alone that keeps it from being torn asunder, end quote. This strength is not merely individual resilience, but the cumulative moral and cultural force generated within Black communities through faith, art, education, and struggle that transforms suffering into a mode of persistence, especially for those who choose again and again to survive catastrophe. Against a world organized to deny their humanity, Black people cultivate forms of consciousness and creativity that reassert the will to live and to imagine freedom beyond the reach of domination. Double consciousness thus names not only the fracture imposed by racial hierarchy, but also the capacity to live and think critically from within that fracture, transforming its pain into creative energy. I'm sorry, I'm slow on the. So here. So in this sense, Du Bois's analytic exposes what Mead leaves unthought. The way the very social order that makes selfhood possible in Mead's account depends on a racialized logic of difference that dehumanizes the Black other. For Mead, the self arises within a social moral community sustained by cooperation and mutual participation. But Du Bois shows that the American experiment with democracy is built upon a hierarchy that denies Black people entry into sociality as human. The universal subject that Mead presupposes is, in fact, a racialized one, defined through the exclusion and subjugation of those rendered non-human. What Mead treats as the social foundation of social consciousness, Du Bois reveals as the historical machinery of domination that fractures it. The projects of democracy and white supremacy are not opposing forces, but co-constitutive. The former imagines itself through the ongoing production of the later. Du Bois thus rethinks the social and ethnological foundations of selfhood, exposing the American democratic ideal as inseparable from the racial order it disavows. His account of double consciousness lays bare the contradiction at the heart of modern subjectivity, the promise of freedom built upon the fact of domination. And yet, from within this contradiction emerges a form of critical intelligence that both perceives and endures the world's duplicity, transforming its wound into a mode of vision. Thus, reframing of the social sets the stage for our next contrast. Dewey's faith in critical intelligence and reconstruction presupposes a world open to reciprocity, and educative growth. So Du Bois will insist that such reciprocity is precisely what a racial order withholds. So Dewey on critical consciousness and reconstruction. So in his essay, Creative Democracy, the task before us, Dewey reminds us that the vitality of democracy depends on the growth of individuals guided by critical intelligence. As he writes, quote, democracy is a way of personal life controlled not merely by human faith in human nature in general, but by faith in the capacity of human beings for intelligent judgment and action if conditions are furnished, or if the proper conditions are furnished. The conditional clause here, if proper conditions are furnished, captures the heart of Dewey's philosophical faith. Democracy for Dewey is not a stable political structure or set of institutions, but an ethical end in view, sustained only through the continual cultivation of intelligence, sympathy, and reflective growth within individuals. The democratic community thrives when the conditions of life, education, community, and freedom of inquiry nurture the individual's capacity for intellectual participation in shared experience. In this sense, democracy is both method and outcome. It flourishes only when individuals are enabled to think, deliberate, and act in ways that expand their own and others' powers of living. So for Dewey, the individual is not a fixed essence, but an evolving product of experience and environment. The self is socially created and sustained through the specific arrangements, laws, and habits that shape human life. Progress, therefore, depends on the dynamic interplay between the individual and their surroundings. Against the notion that individuals are complete within themselves, ultimately separate and unitary beings on which external impressions and belongings only create accidental and fleeting sensations of pleasure, pain, comfort, and security, Dewey argues that individuality must be achieved. It is a continued process of formation that requires reflection, critique, and growth within concrete situations. So the proper conditions for Dewey, then, are not external guarantees, but living practices of inquiry. Dewey's conception of critical intelligence names this very process, the capacity of individuals to recognize how their dispositions, habits, and ideas have been formed, and to engage in the deliberate reconstruction of themselves and their world. In light of this, Dewey explains that critical consciousness begins with the concrete circumstances of lived experience. It inquires into the particular conditions of an environment in order to produce a detailed and specific understanding of the personal and social conflicts that call for transformation. So critical consciousness is not a detached theoretical stance, but a disciplined process of inquiry, an effort to grasp how ideas, norms, institutions, and social arrangements operate within a given context, and to understand what consequences they produce for human life. It examines how individuals and communities live within and respond to these arrangements, identifying the tensions that block growth and the possibilities that might enable it. Dewey cautions against rigid or dogmatic approaches to thought, insisting instead that, quote, specific problems vary with the changes in human life that are always going on and that at times constitute a crisis, end quote. So to meet this variability, general concepts can serve as provisional guides for inquiry, but never as fixed frameworks. They provide points of departure, ways to name and organize phenomena, while remaining subordinate to the unique, evolving character of the situation under study. Critical consciousness, thus, refuses to reduce lived experience to abstract theory. It uses theory in the service of concrete understanding. So recognizing the specificity of each problematic situation allows for close analysis of the multitude of specific structures and interactions that constitute human life. Deweyan inquiry calls us to examine how social, political, and cultural contexts operate as distinct but interconnected causes shaping individual experience. This approach treats individuality not as an isolated possession, but as something formed within and continually remade by the web of social relationships. So in light of this, Dewey proposes the following questions. Quote, what response does this social arrangement evoke? What effect does it have upon those who engage it? Does it release capacity? And what sort of individuals are created? End quote. These questions reveal his emphasis on the environment's role in enabling or constraining human potential. In this way, critical consciousness places significant value on individuality, not as a private essence, but as a social achievement that emerges from and responds to the surrounding world. So the task of inquiry then is to illuminate how particular environments evoke specific responses and to reconstruct those conditions so that they foster rather than block human growth. So for Dewey, growth begins where habit breaks down. Habits are not mechanical routines, but the embodied norms and dispositions formed through ongoing interaction between self and environment. They organize conduct and sustain meaning as long as experience flows smoothly. And this is important for you to know. I'm slow down here. So the only time people question habits is when that you experience your habits as no longer flowing smoothly. Okay. So yet when action is blocked, when old responses fail and the stream of activity is interrupted, a problematic situation arises. So this disruption marks the moment where reflection and imagination must intervene. So Dewey calls this the deliberation process. It's the interactivity through which the self engages in dramatic rehearsal. Within this imaginative space, the individual reconstructs experience by envisioning alternative courses of action, weighing their consequences, and testing their emotional and moral worth. The rehearsal is dramatic because it stages conflict within the self, compelling a confrontation among competing impulses and loyalties until a more coherent orientation emerges. Through this process, constructive imagination stimulates the reconstruction of habits, transforming reflection into a creative force for renewal. Deliberation thus becomes the mechanism of growth, the way individuals turn the crisis of blocked habit into an opportunity for intelligent action and the remaking of both self and world. For Dewey, then, critical consciousness and deliberation culminate in reconstruction. The creative powers of reflection and imagination must be embedded in practice, directing action toward the realization of more meaningful ways of life. When individuals face uncertainty, they must engage in what Dewey calls dramatic rehearsal, imaginatively exploring a range of possible futures and weighing their consequences, because neither the individual's future state nor the conditions of that future can be fully known. Deliberation requires a constructive imagination that can hold competing possibilities in tension. Within this process, choice becomes the hinge between thought and transformation. It is not discovered, but critically created. An act forged from the struggle among competing preferences and the demand to bring what could be, but is not yet, into existence. To choose is to commit to a path that seeks to reorder both inner disposition and external habit, translating imagination into embodied practice. Dewey understands this process of critical creation as a means by which intelligence realizes freedom. The individual participates in their own individuation and in the ongoing reconstruction of the conditions of experience. So dramatic rehearsal thus puts a premium on creative powers that enable human beings to envision and enact new possibilities for growth. Therefore, for Dewey, the goal of deliberation is reconstruction, the renewal of both self and world. Critical intelligence links thought to practice, converting insight into embodied transformation. Choice becomes the guiding force that moves imaginative possibilities toward realization. It is the bridge between knowing and doing, between the present crisis and the possible future. This is the ethical heart of Dewey's philosophy, the belief that human beings, through reflective and creative intelligence, can reconstruct the conditions of life toward greater freedom and democratic cooperation. In this way, Dewey offers a deeply hopeful vision of democratic life, one in which deliberation, choice, and imagination become the instruments through which human beings shape a more just and cooperative world. This hope, however, presupposes a social field willing to be reasoned with, a reciprocity of recognition that will be directly contested by Du Bois's analysis of racial domination. Dewey's vision is powerful precisely because it affirms agency in the face of contingency. He gives us a model of the self as capable of growth, of turning crisis into creation through intelligent inquiry. Yet, as we will see, Du Bois presses this vision to its breaking point. For if Dewey's creative intelligence assumes that reason and imagination can reconstruct the world, Du Bois exposes the deeper problem. What happens when the world's most enduring structures are not simply irrational, but invested in the destruction of Black life? In other words, what Dewey names as the site of democratic intelligence, where individuals deliberate, imagine, and act to reconstruct their world, Du Bois exposes as the site where white supremacy resists reconstruction altogether. Thus, when the very habits and desires that shape social consciousness are oriented toward exclusion and domination, rational reconstruction reaches its limit. It is at this limit between Dewey's faith in human intelligence and Du Bois's recognition of its tragic insufficiency that our next tension unfolds. Well, this is Du Bois on the limits of rationality. In a soliloquy of viewing my life from the last decade of its first century, Du Bois describes himself as being from a similar faith in the power of knowledge. Du Bois describes himself as being from a similar faith like Dewey regarding the power of knowledge. As a founding member of the American Negro Academy in 1897, he believed that science and the scientific attitude could expose the falsehoods of racial ideology and persuade white Americans to abandon its myth in Black inferiority. Through disciplined inquiry and the dissemination of truth, Du Bois hoped that rational evidence will compel moral recognition. In this sense, Du Bois's early project mirrored Du Bois's optimism that the light of reason could dissolve ignorance and secure progress to a more democratic order. From approximately 1894 through 1910, Du Bois understood himself to be a social scientist devoted to gathering the facts that would enable America to progress along a rational, linear path towards capital T truth, where democracy could flourish. He envisioned history as an organic process unfolding toward greater realization of that truth as telos here, and believed that careful empirical study could help humanity move closer to it. So at this point in his life, Du Bois claimed that the problem of race was not more depravity, but ignorance. As he wrote, quote, race prejudice was based on widespread ignorance. My long-term remedy was capital T truth, carefully gathered scientific proof that neither color nor race determine the limits of a man's capacity, end quote. So here, knowledge, not passion, would liberate, and science properly applied could guide humanity toward reason, justice, and democracy. This early phase of Du Bois's career was animated by a profound faith in the scientific method. Scientific method as an engine of moral progress. So at such times, he wrote, true lovers of humanity can only hold higher the pure ideas of science and continue to insist that if we would solve a problem, we must study it. And there is but one coward on earth, and that is the coward that dare not know. So truth in this conception was not an abstract, but historical, a product of systematic investigation and intelligent understanding. So Du Bois's task was to make the world know the Negro through scientific study, replacing superstition and racial myth with demonstrable fact. As Du Bois states, my vision was becoming clearer. The Negro problem was, in my mind, a matter of systematic investigation and intelligent understanding. The world was thinking wrong about race because it did not know. The ultimate evil was stupidity. The cure for it was knowledge based on scientific investigation, end quote. This conviction led Du Bois to integrate history and sociology as tools for diagnosing social conditions, tracing how environment, not biology, shaped human outcomes. By investigating the lived realities of Black communities, he sought to demonstrate that the so-called Negro problem was itself a social creation, evidence not of innate inferiority, but of systematic exclusion. The aim was not only analytic clarity, but persuasion. If the facts were made visible, the conscience of the nation would awaken. So, like Dewey, Du Bois assumed that rational inquiry could reform individuals and through them the social world. So Du Bois believed that by using history and the tools of science, he could offer an account of Black people and of the American nation's Negro problem that presented the facts and moved the country toward truth. So an early example of this approach is The Philadelphia Negro in 1899 that was based on a 1986 study for the University of Pennsylvania. The conclusion of that study directly challenged the white supremacist ideology of the era, particularly the belief that Black people were naturally inferior and destined to die out, making social reform futile. Against this view, Du Bois argued that the condition of Black people had developed and was still developing out of a specific social environment, one shaped by historical, economic, and political forces rather than biology. At the same time, he emphasized the potential for remedy and progress within human history. So Du Bois described this project, quote, as complete a scientific study and answer as could have been given with defective facts and statistics, one lone worker and little money. It revealed the Negro group as a symptom, not a cause, as a striving, palpitating group, not as an inert, sick body of crime, as a long historical development and not a transient occurrence, end quote. So Du Bois explains that he held this strategy until approximately the 1906 Atlanta riot, during which a Black man was lynched, his body mutilated, and his knuckles displayed in a local grocery store. The horror of that event shattered Du Bois's faith in the moral power of reason. After the Atlanta riot, he began to turn away, though not completely, from scientific empiricism and from the unbelief in an inevitable linear progress of human history. In its place, he confronted a world saturated with self-interest and irrationality. White supremacy did not persist because people lacked knowledge. It endured because their identities, fears, and desires were bound up with domination. Quote, the present attitude and action of the world, of the whole world, he later wrote, is based basically not upon rational, deliberate intent. It is a matter of conditioned reflexes, of long followed habits, customs, and folkways. Here, Du Bois identifies what Dewey's framework could not fully explain. The unconscious investments, the desire, fear, and fantasy that make whiteness unwilling to relinquish its power. Rationality, far from liberating the mind, often functions to rationalize the desire not only to see Black people as less than human, but to call for their subjugation and death. In this light, the dialogue between Dewey and Du Bois exposes a deeper philosophical divide. Dewey envisions critical consciousness as the means by which individuals transform themselves and their environments through intelligent reconstruction. Du Bois reveals that such reconstruction cannot begin until the irrational structures of desire that sustain racial order are laid bare. Where Dewey locates hope and reflective intelligence, Du Bois finds tragedy in the failure of reason to grasp its own darkness. Their encounter thus forces the central question of modernity. Can a world built on racial fantasy be remade by reason, or must consciousness first reckon with the depth drive that reason refuses to see? And sorry, I was slow on this. So, in returning back to West and our album, we were reminded that his project, West's project, though profound, risks domesticating the very radical energies it seeks to honor. Yet West's enduring contribution lies in his ability to inhabit rather than resolve what Du Bois reveals as the tension rooted not in thought, but in the lived reality of a world structured by racial domination. To speak from the fissure between prophetic fire and pragmatic reason, to make blues, sermon, and philosophy converge in a single voice. Through his embodied practice, his prophetic cadence, his performative intensity, and his insistence that philosophy must sing with the rhythms of struggle and suffering, West keeps the prophetic alive within the modern university. And yet his example also raises questions for those who follow. So for the graduate students in the room. What will it mean for the next generation of Black thinkers and for all who struggle for a democracy beyond white supremacy to inherit the Black intellectual tradition that the academy so often dismembers? Within professional philosophy, the institutional priority placed on real philosophy as the living memory of the white Western canon threatens to silence the prophetic voices that make philosophy matter. Can prophetic criticism still serve as a model of resistance, or has the price of its survival become too high? How can we balance the demand for professional recognition within disciplines structured by exclusion with the moral and intellectual imperatives of prophetic witness? How might we teach, write, and think in ways that neither surrender to institutional assimilation nor retreat from the demands of philosophical discipline? These questions do not diminish West's achievement, they extend it, pressing us to keep faith with the struggle, to think, and live otherwise. Thank you.
I know probably there's questions that want to be directed towards me, but I at first would really like to capture, just given the time, and ask graduate students and for teachers of graduate students who might want to take up the Black prophetic tradition or the Black intellectual tradition more generally. How do you hold this tension, especially given the institutional demands of what philosophy is, looks like, how you talk, how you write it, how you creatively think through it, the disciplinary boundaries that police what is a great paper or what is a great conference presentation? How do you hold this together?
So generally, I do it by, actually, let me go back. First of all, great paper, like stellar work. But generally, to hold that together, I go back to something that Dewey points out in Experience in Nature, right? Science and rational inquiry, as you painted it, is one phase of experience. Other phases of experience, like art, like religion, like magic, like poetry, right, might be more adept to articulating a given situation, right? This is why in the tail end of Experience in Nature, Dewey says, not scientific inquiry might not be the best tool to articulate every kind of experience, particularly experiences that Du Bois is pointing to.
Yeah.
And so to answer your question, when we're trying to hold the tension together, I point out that there's a whole bunch of stuff that we take as actual philosophy, even in the Western canon, that is art, right? Camus' The Stranger is a novel. Camus' The Stranger is a novel. Much feminist work is done as literature. Even Dewey himself pointed out that the things that we take as sort of great works of philosophy and art had a practical role within experience, right? And this is kind of sort of the point of folks like Audre Lorde, June Jordan, so on and so forth, who say that art is a way of knowing the world, right? So to answer your question, I tell them simply that philosophy doesn't adhere in the logical structure of a good essay, but can be performed or articulated in art and poetry and images, and more practically and institutionally, I have control over my classroom. I get to determine what counts as an A. So somebody wants to write me a poem about existentialism, that's as much philosophy as the 8-page paper. And we've got disciplinary structures that acknowledge that in some cases.
Yeah. So I wish I had more time to write an actual longer paper and present
To
it.
you, because I actually went back and read Art as Experience, and the only place that I really found where he talked about Black art when he was actually looking at Africa and civilizations in Africa and its ability, and art's ability to be able to create sympathy. And so it doesn't seem that Dewey's understanding of even art as experience can take up. I was going to take what Dewey offers in as experience, use Du Bois's criteria for Negro artists, and put that in conversation with his essay on in Texas, Jesus Christ in Texas, because it seems that sympathy, the way that Dewey constructs it, although it's an alternative to scientific facts, isn't strong enough to still penetrate that unconscious desire to see Black people as non-human beings. I'm not trying to argue with you. I wish I had a chance to to write that section, but I did go back to prepare for this, and I also reread Democracy and Education, and I have comments about that too. But I thank you for offering that. But I would say the other place where that tension is going to be, can they hear something and take up Du Bois's essay, Jesus Christ in Texas, where basically Jesus Christ is no longer a white person who is suffering on the cross, Black bodies, right? And so in terms of like art, can the white imagination through sympathy take that up? I mean, so that just remains a question and one of the tension points. But I thank you, John. I appreciate you responding though. I get it.
Dr. Smith, Dr. Flowers sent chills through me.
Yeah.
Because I was going to say that when you do this again, you might realize that when Dr. Stickers used to run things everywhere in the country, he asked me to write a paper for a conference on James Baldwin and pragmatism. But because I didn't have enough money to get to the conference, I never finished the paper. That's just a true fact. But that's what you need to be doing here. Because when you make the distinction between the people in the academy, like Cornel West with his doctorate and James Baldwin with his high school diploma, and when John Flowers brings up art, I immediately thought while you were talking, Toni Morrison in 2015 wrote an essay about this is no time for self-pity. This is a time for art. He brings in Audre Lorde, who is as philosophical as anybody could be, any three people could be on a bad day. The point is, for Cornel West to be performing this is not the same as producing it.
Yeah.
And that is where the price of the ticket and so many other issues come into play here and have to be addressed, because living within the tension, living within the pain, that kind of existentialism that Baldwin produced over and over, and the two people that I think are the best examples of what you're talking about are Baldwin and Toni Morrison. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
And I'm happy with it.
Yeah. No,
I even think Cornel West, if he was here, if he called in, might even say this is a fruitless exercise, right? Because for him, the ultimate criteria is, can a talk like this re-energize folks to gather the courage to struggle against the very hierarchies that he names. So for him, this might be a fruitless exercise.
Crucial time for all three of those people to be talking to us today.
Yeah.
So I may be from a different discipline, but I'm in clinical psychology. So as we sit across from clients and we kind of hold these two things to be true, how can you both have hope and, inspiration and careers and dreams, but then also acknowledge the world in which we're currently living? And I'll just name the administration in which we're currently under. And so I think talks like these help to provide both a hope, but also a framework for like DBT principles in both philosophy to say we can hold these to be true at the same time.
Yeah.
Within one person, we can have both hope and understanding of the system in which we live. So I greatly appreciated this talk, but I think it is extremely relevant today
Thank
and
you.
the conversations that we're having.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Else? So you can ask me questions now too, because no graduate students say anything yet.
Actually, no. Graduate students ask questions. I can bother Joe whenever I want.
Okay.
Less of a question, more of an idea. Dewey places a lot of focus on experimentalism, and I haven't seen very much experimentalism in the design of conferences, academic conferences. It's this very kind of formal, write a paper, present the paper kind of thing. And while there are poster sessions and things like that, I generally don't see space for art, for spoken poetry, for presenting paintings and discussing that.
So maybe given the emphasis on context that we've talked about a lot today, trying to change the context and the orientation of academic events to be more inclusive of experimental methods of doing and presenting and discussing philosophy could be a step forward.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. There are just so many conferences that I've been to before being on the faculty side, even as a student, where you have to go into this various, you have to pristine. And I found those quite boring. But that's also, again, like if Cornel West is your model, like yes, Cornell participated early on, but he was never stuck in the academy. Like even like he was always part of like black churches, black local organizations, and so he's a figure that can show you how to manage to move between and weave through different narratives and spaces and places and modes of being. Because if you see him sometimes, what, why are you talking to him, right? And he's calling people's brothers and sisters and smile, right? So it takes a certain kind of disposition, and I would say Cornel West would be probably the model folks want to turn to for those kind of alternative modes to participate in academic life, even in conferences. So I'll go Colin and Jose. This one because he has first.
So I wanted to bring in Tommy Curry to the conversation and his The Derelict of African American Philosophy. I think that's the title, where he critiques Cornel West for being seemingly too idealist in his thought, and the prophetic criticisms too connected to Christianity and the church, and seems to suggest that we should move towards a more empirical mode of investigation to look at the problems facing Black males instead of a prophetic mode. So I was just wondering if you had something to say about that.
Oh,
So-
of course he does.
This is what I'll say. I'll say, in terms of positioning yourself in terms of the academy, like Cornel West seems to be like Descartes, like a modern father figure. And so in order to dig at him and now position your own self on the rise, there are certain styles and modes of strategic engagement that you'll use to not paint Cornel West in his strengths, but just to highlight the weaknesses while ignoring actually the strengths. And so I'll say the dialogue between them, I think that Tommy Curry engages Cornel West honestly, is a way, just like between Du Bois and what was it, Washington? Was it this
Booker T.
Booker T. Washington, right? They were arguing against each other to see who was going to gain ascendancy to actually be one of the leading figures within contemporary Black movements. And so I would say we'd also have to, from a meta position, read into that conversation and what's going on. So that's what I'll say.
I was just more interested in learning what you conceive to be modernity. Because modernity in itself, depending on what exactly you define as, it's violence, right? It's scientific methods, it's medicine, it's psychiatry, it's all these multiple things that oftentimes when you listen to your lecture and think about these different powers that are at odds or that appear to be one or the other in this particular frame of modernity, I'm not exactly sure what you understand as modernity itself.
Yeah, so I have yet to say what I actually think. I didn't present this paper. So
And so I guess that's
yeah,
the
so
question.
what
do you think?
yeah, but so but the paper was the highlight how Cornel West conceives the two traditions that he thinks he's moving out of. And I would say I mean, Cornel West has written a lot, and I haven't read everything he's written recently, so I can't fully explain to you how he understands modernity. But I'm not taking a position of what modernity is or isn't. My position is to show that if you want to take Cornel West as one of the leading figures
for a strategy to be in the academy, outside of the academy, and to stay close to the canon of Western philosophy, while at the same time grounded in Black history and memory, that this is the tension you're going to have to live out. And so for Cornel West, modernity is all the things you mentioned, plus the African slave trade. Right. But for me, I'm not arguing in this paper like my position. And so it really doesn't matter at this point how I conceive modernity is just to show the tensions between what Cornel West offers.
Thanks, Joe. This is a great paper. There's
Thank you.
a lot
Thank you.
here. So kind of wanted to, there's a lot of terminology.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Right? I think that's because of West.
Yeah.
That's the tension, right, that you're talking about, right? King often talks about it as being a creative tension, right? To sort of like draw the crisis that already exists to the fore, right? So I usually categorize that with my students as like a method of aesthetic demonstration, right? And I'm wondering that usually, at least in King's work, is aimed at, right, sort of disruption, right, or revealing of ignorance, right? Habits of ignorance, oppressive habits of ignorance. But I'm wondering, is that not enough, right? Is that sort of aesthetic demonstration really just disrupting white people's sort of ignorance, right? And is not the same sort of thing that John is talking about, right? A much more robust, right, sort of works of art, right, for the individual, right?
Yeah.
Are those related, right? I mean, do you think that King's sort of idea
You're talking about
that
Martin
fall
Luther
short
King.
as well?
You're talking about Martin.
King.
Yeah, okay. And what
Like the way he sort of focuses on like using the tension creatively, right, to sort of disrupt or to hide.
in what text though? Because and where do we go from here? Chaos or community? He kind of
Yeah.
doesn't that seems not to be there. So, I mean again, like if you can pinpoint like what, so there's again, King has written a lot. I tend to focus on the late King, and I would just say in terms of just revealing that tension point. I mean, we know that the leaders of social movements weren't just worried about their own organization, that they were part of a larger network. And so this, in terms of like Black history memory of struggle and resistance, it's not that one group gets it right. It's that everybody has to participate and put pressure in the ways that they can. And so I would say, in terms of the larger historical context, like no, just revealing that tension isn't good enough, that we're all going to have to participate and put pressure on these structures of hierarchy and power in different ways to potentially bring about this collapse. So that, I mean, that's what I'll offer. Yeah.
Joe, we got two related questions from the
Okay.
live stream chat. Fergus would like to know, one, how Rorty's role in West's sort of reception of pragmatism, how does that figure into this story? Is West's sort of understanding of the tradition Rortyian in some way? And second, what do you make of the decrease over time in sort of explicit references to and engagements with pragmatism in West's work that Fergus perceives?
You're gonna make me recall. So, in keeping faith in American invasion of philosophy, he locates, I forget, I know it's demystification is the one that West argues for, and I forget what the other camp that is just blanking my mind, and I know I just read it, that Rorty takes up. But the point is for Cornel West is that Rorty demystification, which tries to unreveal power structures. And I forget exactly what's his argument of why and how Rorty like doesn't make this move. I just can't recall it at the moment. But I would say just go back into keeping faith. If you send me an email, I'll tell you, because I don't remember the chapter that it's in. I can locate the chapter for you. And I would say turn to American Evasion of Pragmatism, where he talks about Rorty specifically. In terms of Cornel West moving away from pragmatism, I don't see it because almost any lecture
where he's talking in front of a crowd, especially those that philosophers are in. He always talks about how Dewey is a towering figure within the academy. And so, I mean, maybe he does, maybe he, you know, he distances himself from other of practice, but I always hear him talk about Dewey and James. He just West is just not writing as much. So I would say like his last book, Prophetic on Fire, it's not about pragmatism, it's about the Black tradition. So of course he doesn't talk about pragmatists, but I don't see West actually distancing himself from pragmatists. I would say go check out his talks within the last 20-year span, and you'll often hear him talking about classic American pragmatists.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I know what everybody really wants to talk about is Hegel. Right? I mean, it seems to me like Du Bois, the elements of Mead and Dewey that you're talking about are all in some ways kind of naturalistic descendants of Hegel's way of thinking about some of these issues, along with, I would say, I would add Marx and the feminist standpoint theory tradition into that basket. Right? There's Hegelian roots in a lot of these ideas. And, Dewey notoriously and problematically doesn't sort of address domination very often in his work. But on some of the few occasions where he does, he goes right to a kind of version of the sort of Hegelian dialectic of master and slave critique of domination. Right? So is there, we talk about sort of how we deal with these tensions. Is there a Hegelian way to kind of synthesize across these things rather than a kind of a bridgeable impasse, do you think?
I mean, you're talking about the master and slave dialectic. Is that what you're asking specifically about?
I think that's one part of it. Yeah, yeah.
So I don't think through Hegel. So I'd have to like go back and reread and re-engage. So I mean, at this point, that's a really great question. But I'd have to re-engage Hegel and then try to see through like what that looks like. So I'll think about it some more, and maybe we'll have another chance to talk about that.
Great.
So I wanted to ask a sort of Dewey Du Bois question here, right? So one of the things that you say that Dewey can't do is make or provide an explanation for white people's desire to maintain Black subjugation, right? And insofar as that's the case, my question, this again motivates the limits of rational inquiry, right? And so my question here is, what do you make of Dewey's Dewey's concern that first inquiry always takes place within an environmental context, and habits, including habits of inquiry, always incorporate into themselves some aspect of the environment in their what he calls in human nature and conduct, their projectile force, which is what gives rise to the a person's sense of self. So insofar as this is the case, what would you make of a Deweyan explanation that says the continued white desire for domination is habitual or is an inherited sort of habituation passed down through history, right? Which creates conditions, environmental conditions, by which Dewey means like social, cultural, physical, that maintain the sort of supremacy of whiteness, that give rise to the very conditions that Du Bois points to as enabling double consciousness. And you could throw in some Charles Mills there if you wanted, right? So what do you make of that sort of often overlooked strand in talking about Dewey's habits, that they incorporate the environment, and this environment is inherited historically?
Yeah. And I would say that I think that's what Du Bois would agree with Dewey on.
But the point for Dewey is that where habits are broken is where they become blocked and interrupted. And Du Bois thought early in his career that if he actually used statistical and demographic information to show actually that Black people weren't biologically inferior to white folks, that would then act as the interruption to block their habits, but that it's not strong enough. Like presenting folks with knowledge or with what Du Bois says with truth isn't strong enough evidence yet to break in break through, interrupt the habit, to create, and I want to say in enough white folks, that self-reflective mode where they would want to potentially enlarge their lens, enlarge meaning, enlarge their understanding of self in such a way that might lend uh, their reconstruction of habits toward a trajectory and vision that Du Bois is asking of the white world.
So is that a question of method then, or method and means to accomplish an end in view or not?
Well, I mean, it keeps unfolding, so I can't. It's like whatever I offer, it wouldn't be true to the historical trajectory of this country, right? Like we haven't gotten beyond it, and that's why I was saying to Jess that for those of us who still want to participate in racial and social justice on projects, we have to put pressure, like we have to participate where we can and put all kinds of different pressure where we can that may be push us beyond what West talked about earlier, a post-Western world, right? So, I mean, that's the only thing I can say. Like, all we can do is laugh in the face of despair and disappointment and keep struggling on.
All right. Well, I think that's our time. So please join me in thanking our speaker.